What if the next big shock from the Russia-Ukraine war does not come from missile hitting a military base, but from a grain terminal? Well, that is exactly what the latest Ukrainian strikes on Russia's Black Sea port infrastructure have raised fear about. Well, Ukraine has attacked Russian grain export facility at Novorossiysk, one of the most important gateway for Russian agriculture exports. The strikes damaged grain export infrastructure and forced key facility to suspend operation, and almost immediately global grain markets reacted. And interestingly, the irony is also striking here. Ukraine, which is famously known as the breadbasket of Europe, the same country that once helped feed global markets, is now carrying out attacks that could disrupt a critical part of the international food supply chain. And obviously, Russia is warning that the consequences will not stop at this very shore. Moscow says attack on the grain export infrastructure could push global food prices higher. Now, whether that prediction becomes reality depends on how long the disruption lasts and whether more ports are targeted by the Ukrainian strikes. But one thing is becoming interestingly clear. In the Russia-Ukraine war, food is no longer just something produced on the farms. It has become part of the battlefield. So that's why in today's edition of From the News Desk, we will talk about the impact of the Ukrainian attack on Russian grain export terminal and what will happen to the global food supply chain if such attacks become a routine. Well, Novorossiysk is one of the key gateways through which Russian grain reaches international buyers. In fact, Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and its Black Sea port connects Russian agriculture markets with markets across the Middle East, Africa and beyond. The Ukrainian strike therefore hit an economic artillery. In fact, as per reports, two major grain terminals suspended work, and when a large export hub stops loading ships, traders price in uncertainty. Well, ships can be delayed, rerouted or made more expensive. In fact, buyers can rush to secure supplies, pushing prices higher. Now, Ukraine has long carried the title breadbasket of Europe because of its fertile farmland and major grain production. In fact, before the war with Russia, it was a major global supplier. The war turned that strength into a vulnerability. Russia's blockade and attacks on Ukrainian ports disrupted exports, while Kiev deployed alternative routes through the Danube and European land corridors. Yet, the Black Sea remains crucial for both Russia and Ukraine. Now, the pattern is becoming more complicated. Ukraine is increasingly striking Russian infrastructure that Kiev says support Moscow's war efforts, including agriculture and exports facilities. In fact, the paradox is stark here, as attacks on Russian grain infrastructure can affect countries far from the conflict. The Novorossiysk strike comes amid a broader Ukrainian campaign against Russian economic and logistical routes. Now, one example is Wild Berries, Russia's largest online retailer. Ukrainian drones repeatedly struck its warehouse. Kiev says the company's logistics network supplies components used in Russian drone production, a claim Moscow rejects. In fact, news agency Reuters also reported that the attacks damaged around 10% of Wild Berries' logistics capacity. Although Wild Berries is not a grain company, but the attacks reveal the logic of Ukraine's strategy. Hit networks Kiev believes contribute to Russia's war machine. An agricultural infrastructure is especially sensitive because it sits between military economies and civilian survival. A damaged terminal can hurt the enemy's economy, but it can also affect exports, imports, shipping companies, and consumers thousands of kilometers away from the conflict. Now, one strike does not create a global famine, but the danger is cumulative disruption. Russia and Ukraine remain important to the global grain trade. In fact, the World Bank says Ukraine accounted for roughly 6% of global wheat exports before the war, while its share rose to about 10% when maize and sunflower products are included. On the other hand, Russia remains the world's top wheat suppliers with an estimate of 20% share of global wheat exports in 2026. That means the Black Sea is connected directly to food markets far beyond Europe. Countries in North Africa and the Middle East are particularly exposed because many depend heavily on imported wheat. And when Black Sea shipments are disrupted, buyers must look elsewhere. That increases competition from supplies from European Union, Argentina, Australia, Canada, and the United States. But the result can be higher freight cost, tighter supplies, and that's why rising prices. Well, the first reaction usually comes in future markets. In fact, grain futures spiked after this very attack on the Russian export terminal. If disruption lasts, physical prices can also follow. But the scale of any increase depends on how long-term terminals remain closed and whether exporters can shift cargoes elsewhere. Other producers can increase exports, buyers can change suppliers, and traders can draw on stocks. So the latest Ukrainian strike should be viewed as a big warning. Now, Moscow has accused Kiev of deliberately destabilizing global food markets. In fact, Russia's foreign ministry said Ukrainian strikes on grain and agriculture infrastructure were worsening shortage and pushing up global food prices. Well, obviously that accusation comes from a party to the war, but the underlying concern is very real. Attack on export infrastructure have consequences beyond the battlefield. Now, Russia's attack have also damaged Ukrainian agriculture infrastructure and shipping. As per multiple reports, Ukrainian grain shipments fell sharply in the first 2 weeks of August this year compared with the same period last year. So the food security threat is not created by Ukraine alone. It is being produced by a cycle in which both sides attack infrastructure needed to keep agriculture trade moving. Now, Ukraine remains a major agriculture producer, but is also fighting Russia. Its attack on Russian terminals are part of the conflict. The real threat is the weaponization of the Black Sea food corridor. Every damaged terminal, blocked port, or threatened ship adds friction to a system that depends on predictable movement. And if attacks continue across both Russian and Ukrainian export networks, traders may demand higher risk premiums, shipping costs can rise, and most worryingly, vulnerable importers may face large bills. In fact, for poorer countries, that can become a political crisis. Now, the latest strike on Novorossiysk shows how the Russia-Ukraine war is moving deeper into the global food system. Ukraine's strategy of hitting Russian logistics and economic infrastructure may impose cost on Moscow, but it also risks creating international economic shockwaves. It won't be wrong to say the world has alternatives, but adaptation takes time and most importantly money. That is why Black Sea matters so much. It is not merely a battlefield, it is a food highway. And if that highway keeps coming under fire, the next casualty may not be a port or a warehouse. It could be the price of bread on a table thousands of kilometers away from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Well, with that, it's a wrap on today's edition of From the News Desk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm Yash Goyal signing off for Times Now Digital. Until next time, take care and keep watching this space for more such videos.